Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the next phase of day 2 of our Nonprofit Leadership Summit, our panel discussion. I am going to immediately turn it over to my colleague and good friend, Michelle A. Nicholas, Executive Director from Girls Inc. of Westchester County, who will be the moderator for this panel.
Good afternoon, Tom, panelists and colleagues. Thank you so much. Well, we are all here joining for this real conversation on strategic planning, program evaluation. As always, Tom and his team have assembled some great minds, and I am truly honored to be moderating. I learned just a few minutes ago that we might be having individuals who are joining us internationally. So if you want, you can just drop in the chat which city, which state, and which country you are joining us from. That would be so awesome. So to get us started today, we are joined by some amazing panelists, and though I would love to spend all of this time going through deeply their bios, I just picked out a few pieces that I think would be so impactful and relevant to the conversation that we're having today. First of all, we have Dr. Marciana Popescu, if I pronounced that correctly, I'm so sorry, who is an associate professor at Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service and has worked internationally for international development studies, various aspects in this field since 1995. We also have with us Dr. Jim Maletsky, who is a professor in the School of Management in the Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration at Merce College. We have also with us Dr. Tom Coughlin, who is currently an associate professor of graduate business and former associate dean at Mercy College School of Business. And we also happen to have Dr. Noshi Roman, a professor of management, and he is also the director of the Lehman doctoral program at Pace University. As I said, we have an amazing panel, so welcome to you all. We've assembled a number of questions put together by our participants, and we will do our best to get to them all. But as you can see, the time is limited, so we want to kind of jump in and get those questions answered. And what questions we are not able to answer live, we will definitely go ahead and have those answers provided to you at a later date. So let's get started, shall we? All right, COVID-19. In March 2020, everything stopped. We had to assess and even reassess, even we're doing that today, our strategic plans. One of the first questions that I wanted to ask, and that was really kind of put to us, is from your respective vantage points as industry professionals, what are some of the major considerations now prevalent in preparing strategic plans that we should be considering as nonprofit, taking COVID-19 into account? I open that question out to our entire panel.
Oh,
sure, Tom, go ahead.
Okay, I think the biggest challenge that we have with COVID is proximity, and and with everything else, business processes are based upon information flow. And when you look at what's happened in the last year plus, the information flow has been disrupted. And even when we do have infrastructure in place, electronic infrastructure in place to do a lot of this, we lose a lot of the subtleties of the communication and the ease of communication. And so that's one of the areas that you have to spend a lot of time working on. I'm actually writing a book on this whole area right now. But that's the essence of it, is the information flow is the biggest problem. And how do you make that information flow efficient and suit the needs of the individual business processes that you're dealing with? And I'll throw it back to my colleagues.
Sure, I'll build on this issue of information flow disruption. And so this disruption, what it's doing is it's affecting certain specific parts of your strategic plan when which part of it is the part that's being affected is the process, right? The process of, your consideration of resource allocation now suddenly is being impacted because of the information disruption. Your time allocation, previously what could have taken shorter now will take longer. Sometimes what took longer may take less time now for other new medium usage. Similarly, you can have strategic implementation vehicles, like whether partnership or joint ventures, other issues. Those may also now some situation may create a new level of opportunity, but on the other hand, in many cases there will be new obstacles. So information disruption is affecting again and again the strategic management, strategic plan process, and that's a component that I wanted to build on.
I would agree with that 100%, but I would also add to that context, because it really depends upon the type of problem that you're dealing with. Because up until now, the data is showing us that for many people, they're actually more productive now post-COVID than they were previous to COVID. So it's having to do with individual business processes. But many of these things are built upon relationships. My ability to have a conversation with any one of you is built upon whether or not we have a relationship and how well I understand you. For someone who's very close to me, they could maybe, or to you, they could look at you with their eyes and they could communicate volumes. Or they could say 2 words and it may take someone who you don't know a paragraph to say the same thing. So it really has to do with these relationships. And what happens when you don't have the ability to maintain the relationships, those relationships atrophy. And as those relationships atrophy, the efficiency of the business process will atrophy. So I'm really worried about that we've got money in the bank that we're spending, but we're not adding to it. So that could become a problem as we go forward.
If I can just add to this, I think if we bring this back into the realm of not-for-profits, things are even more complicated. We talk about COVID-19 as a public health global crisis, right? But when you're talking about not-for-profits, grassroots organizations that are working with primarily vulnerable populations that already were dealing with multiple crises, so you see the crisis of the population and you see the crisis of the nonprofits that are trying to secure funds to serve this population. Here you have the COVID-19 pandemic that now acts as a complex emergency. So working on a strategic plan during a complex emergency is quite different, because all of a sudden strategy is not the solution, but as Mintzberg put it in 1979, strategy actually becomes that iterative learning process of adapting and responding to contexts, right? And while it is extremely difficult, because we don't know what will happen next. And strategic planning in its ideal form means we're thinking long-term goals, planning together. We don't have that luxury now. We are working in highly uncertain contexts. Yet it is strategy that brings back some of the stability that we need. So I think that's the slight difference when we are talking about not for profit as opposed to the entire world of business.
Well, I was going to agree with that and certainly add to it by saying that certainly I think COVID has demonstrated on an ongoing basis the need for our organization. So with increased need, there aren't necessarily increased resources that are coming along with that. So that's the short term, the big challenge. Now, whenever we think strategy, it tends to be, mission, who we are now, and then where we want to be at some point into the future. That's our vision. That vision may not change dramatically, but how we get there might. And so I do think that COVID is going to be a catalyst, or it's going to be an accelerant for things that were already happening in our environment. So when you look at what your strengths are as an institution and the environment that you exist in, if there were mergers that were on the horizon, those are going to probably be accelerated. If there are things that your organization does well, that's probably going to be, you're going to need to rely on that even more, especially in the short term.
you're saying all of these things, and I think so many of us being in nonprofits, we're so excited that these areas are being recognized, understood. When we think about information flow, when we think about those the relationship opportunities, we think about, really kind of looking at the fact that, yes, we are in a nonprofit space, and it's not just what we're trying to do for in terms of the organizations of itself, but it's those folks that we're serving, right, at the end of the day. And so really kind of really, if we can really kind of just kind of unpack that a little bit and expand on that, I would love to stay with you, Jim, to that question of, really kind of one of the questions that came to us was, nonprofits who embrace the importance of strategic plans are often faced with the challenges of just how to begin, right? And I think that's something that we were just hinting on. What advice would you give to a nonprofit who is really kind of recognizing that, hey, I either have a strategic plan already and I need to kind of do another one, or I don't even have a strategic plan? Where do I begin?
So I think there are a lot of resources out there in terms of kind of how-to models and 12-step process or 8-step process. Are you using a SWOT model? Are you using SOAR? That to me is less important. At its core, first I want to say that managing strategically is equally as important as coming up with the document, the plan. But coming up with the plan is important too. It's an attempt to try to get your head around uncertain circumstances in ordinary times. So to sit down and start at the beginning. I don't know how else to say it. So it's about mission, it's about vision, strategy is how you get there. So those are the action items that help you achieve your vision. And hopefully it's going to be measurable in a way so that you'll be able to demonstrate to your funders, the people who receive your services, your donors, your staff, your board. You're going to demonstrate to all of them that you're being successful along the way. So I think, and then the first step is to pick your process. And if you're going to use an external consultant, that's fine. You don't necessarily have to. And so, again, there are a lot of resources that are out there. Pick your process and put one foot in front of the other. Start identifying your stakeholders and lay out a timeline. How fast is it going to take you to prepare this document, and who all are you going to engage in the process along the way?
Thank you so much for that. Really kind of, as you put it, put one foot in front of the other. I was wondering, Tom, did you have any thoughts that you wanted to share as well in this space?
Yeah, I think Jim is on the money. I think a lot of this has to do with scope. How big an organization are you, and how sophisticated an organization are you? And the more sophisticated people, they probably have more access to more consultants to help them through the process. If you're a smaller organization, or you're an organization with less funding, to Jim's point, you start out and there's like about three or four things you got to do at the same time. You got to understand what your strengths and weaknesses are. So what are you good at internally? What are the opportunities and threats on the outside of your business? But those are all going to be relative to the business environment that you're in. So another good framework might be the Pastel Framework, which says what's the political environment that's going on, what's the economic environment, what's the social environment, what technologies are going to affect you, what's the natural environment, what's the legal environment, and you say, okay, this is what's happening around me. Now that might change what I think my opportunities or threats are. And then once you've got that, one of the frameworks I think that, and me coming from the technology industry, I'm big on a process called OKRs, right? You have this objective. You say, here's what we're trying to do. Here's our vision for the future. If God smiles, the stars align, and everything falls in perfectly, we're going to see this future, right? So now the next question is, what's the next step to get there? And those are the key results that you can measure on a specific period of time, right? And so that may be an easier start. There's no easy thing here, right? And there's no perfect plan. And this is not like accounting where there's a right or a wrong answer, right? This is a process that says that makes sense or that doesn't make sense. And that's the fear that a lot of people have, right? That there are multiple right answers here, if you want to put it that way, that you can go out. So the biggest problem is to get past the fear. and to say, what do I, in a perfect world, what would I want?
Thank you so much for that. As you really kind of started off by saying, think about your scope. What is it that you want to achieve, right? At the end of the day, once you can recognize what you want to achieve, that's really kind of your starting point, and then you can work backwards. As we're thinking about what do you want to achieve and what does that look like, we had one of our questions that came in of really kind of focusing on what are those key areas of focus for evaluation, for even kind of looking at our strategic plans that nonprofits can zero in on. And I wanted to ask, Marciana, as you started off by really kind of taking us through looking at nonprofits specifically, kind of jumping in there right away. What are some of those things that some of those key factors that you believe that, nonprofits needs to zero in on as we're talking about scope, as we're talking about recognizing, putting one foot in front of the other?
Yes, sure. It's very interesting because I was thinking, okay, you can do backward mapping, you can also do forward mapping. And I would start by pointing to 3 questions that I always go through myself whenever I work with community-based organizations or I work on projects. And that is, what do we currently offer? I'm envisioning what we want to do it's one thing, but where do we start? What do we offer in a time like this? Okay, what range of services do we have? And then who do we serve? Who do we target? What are our population groups that we are working with? And finally, what kind of internal and external resources do we have, right? And based on that, for any strategy, what is important is the goal. Is it a clear goal? Do we understand, okay, here is where we start. This is what we want to do. Is that clear? Is that realistic? Is it feasible? It might be realistic, but is it doable here and now? Can we establish small, achievable, and I would say measurable steps to take us to the goal, right? Are the objectives that we are building in our strategic plan measurable? Because as Tom was saying, this is very important. We need to make sure that our progress is measurable. That's part of our accountability to both the population we serve, the staff, and our own organization, and the funders, right? Then equally important is what is the balance between internal and external resources? You are doing our own capacity mapping. Who do we work with? What resources are here? What level of knowledge? What is needed? And then looking at sources of funding. And when we're talking about funding for nonprofits, one important element in any strategic planning is to show that you are thinking of diverse funding. Diversification of funding is so important in a time in which funding is cut left and right. So if an organization depends on one donor or one funding organization, and that funding organization is cutting funds, they are done, right? And we don't want to run into that. And then ultimately, it's like, how is this strategic plan really aligning with the mission of the organization? We adjust, we change slightly, but we still want to stick with the mission. Or if we decide that the mission needs to be changed, then we have to go back, I would add one other thing. I'm coming, as I said, I'm coming from I'm a sociologist, and in my work, I'm using a rights-based approach. So when you are thinking in terms of how is this strategy actually contributing to protecting and realizing the rights of the organization, the rights of the population that we serve, that becomes a very important lens for evaluation as well. And the question then becomes, in my strategic plan, who did I engage with? How participatory was I? And who did I leave out? Why? If we are rethinking services, who are we leaving out? Whose voices are not included? And that needs to be thoroughly processed and discussed.
Thank you so much for that. As you really kind of hit on so many points, really kind of the measurable steps, internal, external resources, funding, really kind of focusing on mission, right? Nochi, you're in this space. You have been doing this work and really kind of recognizing your interest in really kind of the corporate competitive strategy, but more so the CSR. Corporate social responsibility. I would love to hear from you. What is your take with respect to some of these factors that nonprofits need to zero in on?
Well, CSR is something that for-profits do. So not-for-profits just by definition are doing socially responsible activities.
Yeah.
That's by mission. But part of the thing that within strategic plan and program evaluation scheme, what they can additionally think about, and it's essentially building on to Marciana's position, is focusing on alignment. So as she mentioned moments ago about strategic plan becoming aligned with the mission or resources, etc. So I want to think about, I want to bring everybody's attention to at least 4 different kinds of alignment. First is like an internal consistency or internal alignment in itself. So is our marketing and our operations or our accounting and our finance and our outreach and our social media space, all are those functions aligned? As in, do we don't want to have an overemphasis on social media and promise the world when we don't quite have anywhere near these resources or resource mobilized, etc. Right? So something like that. So it's an alignment issue, internal functional alignment. Secondly, as post-pandemic or currently during pandemic situation, the alignment between external environment and what we can or we are promising to do. This sometimes can create a significant fundamental shift to the point that maybe whatever our existing mission was is no longer even valid. We might even have to revise the mission. And even if we don't, at least keeping within the mission, significant alignment needs to happen in business process for external to the company strategy. To make an alignment between the external environmental pressures and company strategy. Number 3 would be the internal resource base of the company, what it can do, and this new ambition that they have, or the slightly revised ambition that they have, are those aligned? And if not, then what kind of new resources need to be either developed or acquired through partnerships or other acquisition arrangements, that approach. And last but not least would be the alignment of what you aim to do versus what you end up implementing to do. So sometimes we have wonderful internal consistency, good external pressures to what we can do. Excuse me for 1 second. I noticed that my computer is about to die. I have to charge it before.
Technology.
Yes, I just noticed the red line. I thought if I got booted out, it would take me a long time. Sorry about that. Got alarmed there. So last but not least is that the implementation, so that your intended strategy versus the implementation and alignment between that. Often what we starting not-for-profits can be wonderful in planning, wonderful in making sure that their plan is consistent with the external needs, and quite well resource equipped as well. But then there's some kind of lethargy in actually getting it done, whether it's a certain kind of personality of the founders or what have you, but somehow the implementation moment, the doggy brakes are on and nothing is moving at that point. So that to solve that, certain structure and control features need to be in place as well. So those are things that I wanted to kind of chime in.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You said the doggy breaks. So I think we're gonna call that, we're gonna hold on for that for a second. We're really kind of thinking, as you were mentioning, really the getting it done, right? We've had these conversations and the next step is to get it done. How do we get it done? What does that look like? Tom, I'm wondering if you can jump in and here to really kind of reach out to this particular question that we were being asked is, how do automated solutions and processes best fit into the strategic planning and evaluation process?
When you ask a question like that, there's something that strikes me is there's 2 books that come to mind immediately. And one was originally an article in the Harvard Business Review by Nicholas Carr in 2003 called IT Doesn't Matter. And another one is a recent one this year by Cal Newport from MIT, who wrote a book called A World Without Email. And there's, the thing about automation is it's like a saying in fashion, just because it comes in your size doesn't mean you should buy it. Okay. Just because there's a new tool, it doesn't mean you should use it. The point of automation is really to go back and look at the business process and say, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And is this process working? Now, that process working is in context with what is available in the environment and what the expectations are of the recipients of that service. You know, when I was a kid, my father worked in real estate, and he was at one point managing a portfolio on the West Coast for a large insurance company.
Mhm.
He would mail the contracts, first class mail, to the West Coast for the person trying to rent the space, who would then redline the contract and mail it back to New York, where it was retyped and it was sent back and forth. It would take weeks in which to do this process. You know, this process today, we write an email, someone makes a couple of comments on the Word document, and it all happens in an afternoon. You know, what is the expectation? What are the possibilities that are available? What is reasonable for the environment and for what you're willing to spend in order to get there, right? What's the cost of that efficiency? So automation is important, but it also makes you have to take a look at it and say, what works for us in this context at this time, given these variables? And that will change over time, right? That will change with the technology that's available, and that will change with the expectations of the customers or the needs of the customers. So, and just buying technology doesn't make you better, right? This is like a gym membership. Buying a gym membership does not make you healthy. It's going to the gym and doing it on a regular basis. In fact, you don't even need a gym. I'm going to talk about, like, Herschel Walker was one of the greatest college football players of all time. And he says he got there just by doing sprints and push-ups. Okay. So, there's a point.
Mhm.
What is going to work for you? And just saying, oh, we got to automate. Well, what do we automate? How we automate? What are we trying to achieve? How much is it going to cost us? How long will this be viable before the next technology comes out? Right. So these are all, there's not a plus or minus here of this is absolute, right? It's all about what makes sense in this particular situation, and it will evolve over time, and that's the part we have to keep looking at and reassessing, going back to that Pastel analysis and saying what's changing in the technology, what's changing in the social environment, what's changing in the political environment, so on and so forth.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that, because I'm thinking about your dad and the mailings of those contracts and back and forth. That'll take some time. I don't see that working today, but the reality is that you're right, that it's evolving. We're all learning. This is definitely new territory, because we have some of our nonprofits who are a small mom and pop, and we have our nonprofits who are much larger. And unfortunately, COVID did not care. So it impacted us respectively across the way. So thank you so much for sharing that. When we think about it not being really kind of a cookie cutter dynamic, one of the things that
on the move. When you get a chance, please call me back at 914-968-4717.
I'm thinking that we need to mute someone.
Once again, this is Nancy, Westchester Disabled on the Move.
Thank you, Avery. I know the person was just trying to leave that message. So, another question that came in, that one that really hits home, is really, adapting the approach of looking at our nonprofit programs from a corporate perspective. What do we see as some of those key areas that should be focused on to ensure that us as nonprofits are hitting the mark, which is really kind of like important for the corporate sector as we continue to serve our communities. And so, Jim and of course, I would love for you to start off by jumping in there, and Noshi, if you can also follow up on that, given your background as well, that would be so great for us. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to acknowledge a couple of things. And I am a faculty member in the School of Management, the business school, but I am in a Department of Public and Nonprofit Administration. So I actually come from a public administration background. So business is certainly not the enemy, and neither is government. And so nonprofits do exist in this different space, though. And they have a public service mission. So they are engaging in things that in some cases governments may have done in the past, or may complement, supplement things that government had done in the past, but we don't have the ability to tax. So the bottom line is sometimes a little bit more unstable. And unlike for-profit businesses, and it's not that for-profit businesses don't engage in corporate responsibility and don't have missions that aren't that don't help their communities. I think
Did we lose Jim?
I think I froze up there for a second.
Okay,
Sorry.
you're back.
I'm back. So nonprofits exist in this space between government and business. And we have this, and what I refer to it as is a double bottom line. And that is that we've got to be financially viable. At the same time, we have this public service mission that doesn't always lend itself to profitability. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we develop these strategic plans, and as we develop goals that hopefully we're quantifying and measuring along the way. So yeah, I guess I can kind of stop there. I apologize for blinking out on this before.
Technology.
Michelle, would you rephrase that question one more time?
Sure, absolutely. Thinking about, adopting the approach of looking at our nonprofit programs from a corporate perspective, and what do you see as key areas that should be focused on to ensure that nonprofits keep hitting the marks, which are important to the corporate sector, while at the same time continuing to provide and offer the service that we are committed to the communities.
Thank you. So again, yes, definitely not-for-profit organizations are different, and yet still they are organizations. And so certain broad organizational goal achievement issues are somewhat consistent with for-profit environmental space as well. So in for-profit environmental space, the strategy implementation aspects focus on quite a bit on control and coordination aspects, and also on structure, organizational structure, staffing issues, compensation issues, budgeting issues. So those broad issues are literally, a copy and paste issue in a situation for not-for-profit. You ought to focus on implementation of your goals through control, coordination, and improved structure. Let's also not forget that although different, governance is a key issue also in not-for-profit. Instead of board of directors, you have board of trustees, but still governance nonetheless. Other than that, I think once you start to get into more deeper issues, yes, instead of corporate social responsibility, you could probably think of not-for-profit's role as, not-for-profit financial feasibility, right? So because that's not your main goal. Your main goal is to do social good and accomplish that social good, but you want to do it in a manner that is financially feasible. Then only it's creditworthy. If you are burning out resources and accomplishing some social good, others could have probably done that same thing. It is your responsibility to be most efficient in doing that same amount of social good using the financial resources that you use or other resources that you're using. So that resource burn rate needs to be closely examined. Quite a bit of research in not-for-profit focus on not-for-profit administrative efficiency, again, how much of the total dollar collected is being then utilized, what percent of it is utilized for doing social good versus what percent of it is used for their base, internal administration purposes. And yeah, to that end, certain nonprofits have started to create some, a little bit of a gray area, and that's the direction in which I've been writing a manuscript. And it's basically that this idea of not-for-profits generating for-profit space for them. Like when you think of it, Girl Scouts of America generates a tremendous amount of revenue, and if we look into its finances, it's probably like they're probably making a killer profit onto the
larger
cookies. And
Yeah,
quite frankly, that's just one example. There's quite a few of those like that.
Thank you.
Just
Yes,
one
yes.
quick thing to add on. So certainly financial viability and understanding your business model and how it is that your organization survives financially is important. At the same time, our goals aren't on the other side of that bottom line related to our mission. We need to think in terms of impact. We need to think in terms of outcomes, not outputs. And so those, as you're shifting from kind of strategy to evaluation on an ongoing basis, you want to make sure that you've got a handful of metrics that really speak to the most important aspects of your entity, both on the financial side and the mission side. And on the mission side, that should speak as much to impact and outcomes as opposed to just counting heads in a workshop or beds filled, or and we have several college faculty here, the number of students and seats. So it needs to go beyond that.
Thank you so much, Jim, for sharing that, because we're talking about nonprofits. We're talking about as Noshi mentioned, really recognizing that we want to do good, right? But going back to the fact that we have to balance, we have to create this balance for our strategic planning and evaluation. We need to make sure of that, because we want to ensure that we are not overwhelmed at the end of the day. I would love to stay with you both for just a second. If you can really kind of talk about, maybe giving us some advice on ensuring that we're not overwhelming. We're looking at the strategic planning process, as well as, maybe that evaluation process, just so that we can, maybe it's some articles, some books, as Noshi, you mentioned, you're right in the middle of drafting. We are all here just trying to get as much information as we possibly can. So if you can give us some guidance, some additional guidance on striking that balance to ensure we do not overwhelm ourselves, that would be so helpful. I'll start with Jim.
Okay, I guess I'm not quite understanding the question.
Sure. So let me throw it back again. So, kind of thinking about what advice would you have to give, when we're thinking about balancing our strategic planning and evaluation to ensure that it does not overwhelm a nonprofit, but it sufficiently gives us the opportunity to be more detailed.
Okay, so in terms of resources there, I guess I have been in the room and tried to facilitate groups as they've come up with their strategic plan. How are we going to operationalize this and make that transition from strategy, big picture, to operations? And everybody has a half a dozen metrics, and if you've got a half a dozen goals with each one a half a dozen strategies, pretty soon the number of metrics that you have gets to be a little bit overwhelming. And so understanding kind of that dashboard, that handful of strategic metrics that maybe your board's going to be most interested in. You may have more metrics that you use to evaluate your programs on a day-to-day basis, but which ones are you going to share with kind of the board or your boss on a regular basis? And in my mind, I mean, that's balanced scorecard is kind of one of the ways to do this, where you identify just a handful of kind of strategic metrics that help speak to your mission, ultimately your goals.
Thank you. And Noshi?
Yeah, I was thinking about this issue. So, you know, when we engage quite a bit on strategic plan, which we talked about quite a bit already, and after investing quite a bit of resources to do proper analysis of the environment and formalizing a plan and setting up implementation plans, it's quite possible that the document in and of itself, the strategic plan document, can start to achieve a status of, I don't know, like a high status in the organization. Like, oh, that's a plan, you know, like putting it on the top shelf kind of a thing. And first of all, that will create a detachment from the roadmap to your actual, what it's supposed to serve as. You know, your roadmap is supposed to be like, you know, sturdy, and like, you know, you should be using it all the time, so that it's like in a really heavily used document as opposed to like this very fancy thing. So that's one issue. And the other issue is, if you start to get married into this idea of strategic plan, like, you know, become so attached that you can't just kind of quite become flexible, that's when the problems of rigidity creep in. We want to kind of strike a balance by accepting that you know, it doesn't have to be like a full laid out plan. Just like, you know, even in contracts, when we try to plan on contracts, if we try to think of all contingencies, the costs are going to be staggering, because you don't have to think of, like, you know, the thousands of clauses. Instead, we just, you know, accept that things could go wrong, but this is the broad roadmap, and we're going to keep our antennas up. And if things happen, we'll catch them. We'll nip problems in the bud. And if opportunities start to emerge, we'll seize them before others do. You know, and, you know, we'll keep producing forward. If we do that, then we're not investing as much time in our plan. I mean, clearly some time investment is necessary, but at least we're not getting too attached, and we're not spending too much time. Instead, we're starting to allocate some of our time and resources and talents into execution, into, you know, and striking a balance as a result of that.
Thank you so much. You know, I left there, you know, I kept hearing that you're using striking that balance. And I think that is, you know, that was the start, actually, when we put really kind of ensuring that there is those opportunities at the end of the day for us as nonprofits. We know that we are all looking at our financial spaces. We're all trying to get those relationships. We're all trying to build, but really kind of making sure that we know what, you know, we are listening to those that we are supporting, while also listening to those that are within our offices, within that space at the end of the day. You know, Marciana, biasly, you know, I'm just so excited by the work that you're doing, because of the fact that, you know, I'm the executive director of Girls Inc. of Westchester County. So it's beautiful that you're doing this amazing work. And so I wanted to throw this out to you. You know, are there any recommendations that you could share to guide the creation of a strategic plan that meets the goals of the organization while addressing the needs and welfare of the people involved in the process? I think, you know, I know that you started there. I would love, you know, if you can really kind of expand on that.
Absolutely. And, you know, like, this is always a tension with not-for-profits, because we are seen as the do-gooders, the ones that are focusing and are supposed to provide service. But organizations and the staff working, the service providers, are also people that have their own needs and need to be, like, considered in any kind of strategic planning. So years back, putting on one of my multiple hats, I was the director of evaluation for a national program that aimed to introduce trauma-informed care in different agencies. Most of them were dealing with child welfare, but not only. And it is very interesting, in the process, what is most important is to understand this notion of organizational readiness. And that was forgotten so many times, and it is still forgotten, because when we are working on a strategic planning, maybe we need to step back and to ask ourselves, why are we doing that? What requires that? What imperatives are we working with? This is a policy change that is brought onto the organization, and the organization has to respond. And in that case, we need to assess, where are we? What kind of capacity do we have? To what extent our strategic planning, dictated from outside, to what extent will it stretch the organization? To what extent does it engage the staff? What we noticed in that project was that wherever the staff was fully engaged and involved, and wherever their feedback was constructively used in informing strategic planning, it worked out nicely. Wherever it was not, it didn't, because the resistance to change was through the roof. People perceived many of these requirements as asking them to do more for less. So the motivation is being lost. There is no understanding of the need of the process. That's extremely important. Really understanding, where is this coming from, and how ready is the organization to do whatever we decide we want to do, right? And then there is the other side. It's not only engaging the organization, because the services that we provide are catering to communities. So we also want to know, how ready is the community? Is this responding to an actual need of the community, or is this just satisfying a policy mandate that happens to be funded? Many times, if we are realistic, if we are honest to ourselves, we go with the funding opportunities. And that's okay. But we need to think, okay, how do we align this with what the communities need? And what kind of feedback loops are we creating through our strategic plan to be able to understand to what extent does this really respond to the community? What are our contingency plans? Always have contingency plans, because March 2020, right? No one thought that we would stop for more than a year now, and we would work in different iterations, and we would, consider new modes of service delivery. Yet here we are. So contingency plans are important. I'll add one other thing, and I'll shut up for the rest of the time. There are two I's that I think are extremely important in strategic planning. At any level, businesses are actually taking this very seriously, but even more important for not-for-profits. Interdisciplinarity. Creating teams that bring in different professional perspectives, right? Different ways to look at what needs to be done and how can that be done. Different skills that you bring into your organization, therefore, really increasing its capacity. That's one. And the second I is innovation. Innovation. Businesses are talking about investment with a social impact. That's done through innovative approaches. And many times we're thinking, oh, we are not for profits. That doesn't mean that we cannot follow business models that are working. And many of these business models have innovation at the core. So I think these two I's are important in revisiting our current strategic plans and developing new ones. And then thinking of what is our impact? Tom mentioned impact before. What is our impact? How do we measure it? And from my perspective, and I am biased here, how does our work contribute to really protecting and promoting the human rights of the populations we work with and the populations we serve?
Thank you so much for that. We have I just have to take deep breaths right there. Thank you so much for sharing that. And of course, I am biased as well, but I think we all are. Right, as we continue to do this important work, and as in your respective professions and field, you continue to serve in your various capacities to ensure that that strategic planning is part of the process, that flexibility and impact is part of the process. So we are, definitely almost close to the end. And so we have one final question that I'm just going to throw out to everyone so that we can just kind of get your ultimate take. And Jim, I'm so sorry, I'm going to start with you. Okay. Right. We've spent all of this time really kind of talking about organizations, nonprofits. So the question is, how important is it to incorporate what the organization is already doing into the creation of a strategic plan. And I know that we heard a little bit about that just now. And how much flexibility has your work, your research revealed as, really kind of ensuring that this is done? So let me say it again. How important is it to incorporate what the organization is already doing into the creation of a strategic plan? And how much flexibility has your research or work revealed as necessary in this, to consider this?
So I think it's really important to understand, and most strategic plans, you'll do an environmental assessment, right? And you'll look at your internal strengths, who you are as an institution, what you do really well. It's important to understand that and build that into your strategic plan. At the same time, if you're thinking strategically, this is also a time to challenge yourself. And it's a time to create maybe some stretch goals, and they shouldn't be unrealistic. But and so there are a lot of ways that we can encourage creativity in the development of goals and understanding what our environment, our organizational environment looks like. So certainly making sure that you have a good understanding of your organization is important, but that's not the entirety of what it's about. It is also about trying to understand the environment that you're in and what new opportunities might be out there for your organization. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jim. Noshi?
I think I'll try to coin a phrase like a measured flexibility. Right? So you want to be flexible, but as much as possible within the confines of staying close to the core. Any given organization, be it for-profit or not-for-profit, has certain core strengths. Think of it as a big like tree analogy. The main saps that flow through the main trunk is essentially then reaching to the branches. So you are flexible. The tree is flexible in terms of producing whatever branch it wants to produce, but it cannot get outside the confines of its main core. Right? So if the organization, let's say a not-for-profit organization, is really has deep understanding about the blind and helping the blind, then all sorts of different initiatives to help the blind. But so you can be as flexible as possible, but within the core, because as soon as you get out of the core, then you're kind of losing your fundamental strength base, and you're kind of challenging yourself into. Then you expose yourself to become mediocre in the competition of doing good against others who might be much better suited to do other good in other spaces.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. Tom?
I was listening to this and I came to mind was one of the things that Jack Welch used to say. Now, Jack Welch, of course, was the former CEO of GE and probably one of the most successful CEOs of the 20th century. And he would ask his executives, if we weren't already in this business, will we get into it today? And if the answer to that is no, then maybe you should be taking those assets and redeploying them into something else. And what happens is very often the things that we do have a certain amount of momentum. We've been doing them, and this is what we do. Well, should we be doing that? And there's a fear about changing from that. But I would say question your assumptions, because very often the assumptions you had in the past may have been relevant at the time, but are no longer relevant. And also question your outcomes, because very often your outcomes may not be the ones you intended, but they may actually be good, right? Simple things like NyQuil was never supposed to put you to sleep, but when they realized it did, they said, hey, this has got a great property. Let's sell it as something that puts you to sleep. So you have to look at your outcomes and say, is there something valuable in what I am getting?
Thank you, Tom. I did not know that about NyQuil. Thank you so much for that. You've just been dropping a lot of jewels for us today. Marciana, I wanted to give you the last word.
Well, thank you. It's very rare I have the last word, so thank you very much. I think absolutely, like whatever is worth keeping, as Tom said, needs to be kept. But then, we have to be critical with ourselves. Definitely do not throw away the baby with the water. I hope I got that correct. And at times you might feel like throwing away the baby with the water. Don't. But really think through, okay, what are we here to achieve?
Mhm.
What is our unique product, if you want? How can we collaborate with others to actually reach bigger and better outcomes? Or in some instances, is bigger better? Because that's another constant challenge for many organizations. They are rethinking their strategic plans and they want to go bigger. But do they have the resources? Do they have the know-how? Do they have the staffing? Do they have the readiness to go bigger necessarily? So finding that balance through an honest look at ourselves. The other thing that was continuously discussed in the chat during this time was this whole issue of diversification. And there are like this all new imperatives that are important. But what we need to do in our strategic planning, in our thinking, how do we address racism, injustice, sexism, you name it, xenophobia, how do we address it through the structures that we put in place? We really need to move from tokenism to intentional change. And that, requires a lot of, reflection and honesty, but it is important. So I think these are some of the elements that we need to consider when we are looking at what we're doing and what we want to do.
Thank you so much. You've just kind of lumped it all in, and we're just so excited by that. Think about the relevance of the information that has been shared today. Marciana, Jim, Noshi, Tom, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We are grateful. I don't want to say we were in your debt, but we are grateful that you spent this amazing time, that you've been able to share with us. We are so thankful that you were present with us today. I know that there's going to be some additional information that is going to be shared, but in the vein of allowing my dear friend Tom to close us out, I'm going to pass the mic back over to Tom. Tom?
That's kind of you, Michelle. I appreciate it, but I will be very brief. I just want to echo everything Michelle said. Thank you, doctors Popescu, Maletsky, Coughlin, and Rahman. I hope I got your names correct. And if I did 3 out of 4, I'll live with that, but I'll apologize. And thank you, Michelle, for serving as our moderator. As always, you did an amazing job. Thank you to our team here at the United Way for putting all of this together. Truly, none of it happens without them. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you found day 2 of our Nonprofit Leadership Summit informative, and you'll hope we'll be here tomorrow and the rest of this week. We have a lot of great keynote speakers and panels planned for you. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.